I shouldn't be alive right now. Statistically, scientifically, by every law of nature, I should be dead. The plane went down on a Tuesday. I remember, because I had a math test on Wednesday I was stressed about. Funny how that works. 1 second you're worried about quadratic equations. The next, there is no next. Just fire.metal. Screaming. Then nothing at all. Then dirt in my mouth. And smoke in my eyes and heavy silence. My name is Kai. I'm 14 years old. And I've been completely alone in this jungle for 6 full days now. Well, not entirely alone. That's the part that actually keeps me up at night. Something found me on day 2. Not a rescue team. Not another survivor. Something with way too many legs and eyes that never once blinked. And for reasons I still absolutely cannot explain. It didn't kill me. It didn't leave either. It just stayed. Let me back up a little. The crash itself I barely remember. I was in seat 1 for C. Window seat. Headphones in. We hit turbulence over the rainforest. The kind that drops your stomach before you decide to hold on. Then the oxygen mask dropped down. Then the screaming started. Then I woke up on the ground. Completely alone. Broken trees scattered around me. Smoke drifting sideways through them. Silence that felt too heavy and too complete. I had a deep cut above my left eye and my ribs screamed with every single breath. But I was still breathing. That felt like both a miracle and a mistake at the exact same time. Like something out there hadn't decided yet. I called out for maybe an hour straight. Nobody answered. I found a backpack near the wreckage. Not mine. Inside, 1 water bottle, 1 protein bar, a lighter. I found a torn blanket, 1 working flashlight. I did not find any other survivors anywhere near the site. I don't talk about that part much. I just don't. By nightfall I had built something that vaguely resembled a shelter. Sticks, leaves, fear holding it together. A 14-year-old with 0 survival training and a YouTube-level understanding of wilderness. Basics. Spoiler. YouTube does not prepare you for actual jungle. The sounds alone nearly broke me completely. Why? Everything out there clicks and hisses and screams and rustles all at once all night, without stopping. Nothing ever rests out there. Nothing is ever quiet. The jungle has a pulse and it's always running faster than yours. I barely slept at all. When I did manage it, I dreamed about my mom's voice the morning I left for the trip. She told me, "Text me when you land." I never texted her. I think about that specific thing every single day. Data started bad and got worse fast. I found a stream. Lucky. I drank from it without thinking. Stupid. I followed it hoping it would lead somewhere actually useful. Instead, it pulled me deeper and deeper into the trees. That's when I first heard it. Not a growl. Not a roar. Something else entirely. A dry rhythmic scraping sound. Like armor plates dragging through dead leaves. Heavy. Deliberate. Getting louder. Getting closer to me. I froze completely. And then it came out of the brush about 4 meters ahead of where I was standing. I want to be very precise about exactly what I saw because I understand how this is going to sound to you. It was a scolopendra. A giant centipede. Not the kind you Google and think, okay, whatever, that's big. This thing was the full length of my entire arm from shoulder to fingertip. Maybe even longer than that. Maybe worse. Its body was dark reddish brown and segmented like a long train of tiny overlapping armored shields stacked together. Each single segment had its own pair of legs. Yellow legs. Too many legs. All of them moving in perfect horrifying sync. Its head was broad and flat with 2 curved fangs in the front that flexed slowly like it was tasting air. Its antennae swept the ground ahead of it in slow deliberate arcs. And then its eyes landed directly and fully on me. Small eyes a dart. Clustered. The kind that don't move the way normal animal eyes move. Just fixed. Every single part of my brain screamed run right now. My legs looked at the whole situation and decided absolutely not. I stood there completely still and completely useless while the biggest bug I'd ever seen studied me. The scolopendra stopped moving. We looked at each other. I'm pretty sure I stopped breathing entirely. It took 1 step forward, then another. Then it was close enough that I could hear a low mechanical hiss. I could see the individual texture of its exoskeleton. I could see the fangs flex again. Then nothing. It just sat there, looking at me for what felt like a full year. Completely unreadable, completely calm. Then it turned toward a large exposed root to my left. It settled there, curled slightly, and went still. Like it had already made some kind of internal decision about me. Like it had decided before it even got close to me. I stood in that exact spot for 10 more minutes. Then I walked backwards, very slowly, very carefully. Then I turned and walked quickly. Then I ran. I ran back to my shelter and shook for 40 solid minutes. That should have been the end of the story. That should have been my weird jungle close call. Moving on. Except the next morning it was there, outside my shelter, just sitting, just watching. Just there. I screamed at it as loud as I could. It didn't move. I threw a stick at it. It tracked the stick, then looked back at me. I yelled at it for 10 straight minutes. My voice was definitely not shaking, okay? It was shaking a lot. Nothing worked. It just waited there with the patience of something that has never had anywhere to be. By noon on day 3, I had started talking to it out loud. Not because I'd lost my mind. Well, maybe a little. But the silence was worse than the fear, and I needed something to push back against. Even just a stare. I named it Rex. I know. Not creative. But I was surviving a plane crash alone, so naming wasn't my priority. Okay, Rex, I said, slowly finishing the very last half of my protein bar. What exactly is your deal here with me? Rex cleaned one antenna with his front legs and stared at me with those fixed, unblinking cluster eyes. Right. Super helpful. Thanks for that. I stared back. He didn't react. Perfect communicator. Really. Here is what I genuinely could not work out in my head. Scolopendras eat lizards and frogs and small mice. They do not follow injured teenage boys through the jungle like some kind of armored nightmare shadow. They definitely do not show up every single morning like they've got a set schedule. And somehow you're on it. But Rex did. Every morning, without fail. And slowly, painfully slowly, I stopped flinching at him. So I started watching him closely instead. And once I got genuinely past the horror of what he was, I noticed something. The way he moved was actually extraordinary. Every leg operated independently in total coordination, like 1,000 tiny decisions all happening at once and somehow arriving at the same perfect answer. He could cross terrain in for seconds that would take me 10 careful minutes to navigate on my feet. He felt vibrations moving through the ground long before I could hear anything with my ears. His head always turned first, always a few seconds before I noticed a sound, always toward the exact direction it was coming from. I started paying very close attention to that habit on day 4 when his head snapped left suddenly. I grabbed the flashlight and backed up without thinking. 30 seconds later, a wild boar, couch-sized, crashed through the brush exactly where Rex had been looking. It didn't come at me, but it would have. Okay, I said quietly with my heart still trying to leave my chest. That was genuinely useful, okay? Rex settled calmly back down like absolutely nothing had happened. I stared at him for a long quiet moment. What are you? He cleaned his antenna again. I stared. He stared. Great. Excellent dynamic we built here. Very healthy. By day 5, I had genuinely stopped thinking of Rex as something that was eventually going to kill me out here. I hadn't started thinking of him as safe exactly. More like, unpredictably, accidentally, annoyingly useful. In a jungle, alone, with no food and no signal and no rescue visible. The distinction stops mattering. I started following his directional lead when he moved. Not right behind him. I kept my distance, but still, he always seemed to know where water sources were. He always paused before unstable ground or mud traps. I don't know if he was doing it on purpose. I don't know if purpose means anything to a giant centipede, but I was still alive, and he kept appearing every morning. So I kept watching, and I kept following his lead. Day 6. This is when everything changed. I had been feeling genuinely unwell since the previous afternoon. The stream water, not clean at all, it turned out, had finally fully caught up with me all at once in a bad way. Dizzy, weak, stomach at war with itself. I was sitting against a wide tree feeling deeply sorry for myself. Rex was sitting about 3 meters away doing whatever Rex does and whatever passes for Rex's version of a private life. And then from above, something dropped, a spider. Big, landed directly on my forearm without warning. Now I need you to understand something clearly. I am genuinely not afraid of spiders. Generally, as a rule, normally. But generally does not include palm-sized spiders landing on bare skin when you're already at your limit. Not when you're already sick and exhausted and emotionally running on absolutely nothing whatsoever except raw stubbornness. I made a sound. I'm not going to describe what kind of sound. It was a sound. It happened. We're moving on now. I went to shake it off and it moved fast. I had my arm toward my shoulder before I could get a grip on it. Before I could do anything else, Rex was there. I didn't even see him move. He was just suddenly present. He had positioned himself directly between me and the spider with a speed that genuinely didn't track with normal physics. The spider retreated immediately and completely, like it recognized something real in Rex, like it knew not to push this. Rex watched it go. Then he settled down next to me, closer than he'd ever been before, and went still. I sat there shaking. The spider was gone. Rex hadn't touched me. He had simply shown up. That was all. You actually just did that, I whispered. Rex's antennae moved slowly. His eyes stayed on the trees. I looked at him. Really looked. for the first time with something other than fear running the show. He was genuinely terrifying, long and dark, and built entirely for violence by millions of years of evolution. Every part of his body was a weapon that had been tested and refined over an incomprehensible amount of time. And he had chosen not to use any of it on me, not once, for 6 consecutive days without explanation. Why? I asked quietly. He didn't answer, obviously. But in that moment, sick and alone and exhausted, having something beside me that wasn't afraid and wasn't leaving felt like the closest thing to okay I had. I didn't sleep particularly well that night, if I'm honest. But I slept, and Rex was there in the morning like always. Now here's the part that's going to sound stranger than everything I've already told you. Stay with me. On the 7th morning I woke up and Rex was simply gone. The very first time since day 2. Just completely gone. I sat up fast, scanned the trees in every direction, checked the route where he usually settled. Nothing. Double quotes Rex. Silence. Just the jungle doing its constant pulsing thing all around me like I hadn't spoken. I told myself very firmly that it was fine. He was just an animal, not a guardian angel, not a companion. Not mine. He'd simply moved on somewhere else. That was normal animal behavior. That was how this worked. I was absolutely fine. I started packing what little I had. Water bottle, flashlight, blanket, the lighter with no fuel left. Then I heard it, that scraping rhythmic sound, but louder than usual. Faster, coming from my left hard. Rex burst through the brush at a speed I had never seen him move before and stopped right in front of me. Body coiled slightly, alert in a way that looked different from his usual watching. Something was different. His head kept turning, back toward where he'd come from, forward toward me, back again. Forward. Back. What is it? What? He moved 3 full meters forward through the brush, stopped hard, looked directly back at me and waited. I've read enough stories to recognize that moment. I grabbed my backpack without another word and followed. He led me through the jungle for about 20 minutes, fast and purposeful, nothing like his usual pace. I was almost running to keep up, branches hitting my face, my ribs making their feelings very clearly known. And then I heard it. Voices. Human voices carrying through the trees. Real ones. Actual human voices. I crashed through a tree line into a clearing and nearly went down completely before I caught a root. 5 people. Orange vests. A radio crackling with static. A map spread between 2 of them on a log. Search and rescue. They heard me before they saw me. Then they all turned at once and ran toward me. Someone actually caught me before my legs could make their final collective decision to stop cooperating with the situation. Someone said my name, actually said my name out loud, like they had specifically been looking for me. They told me the search had been running for 7 full days. They'd been close twice. Train pushed them off. I told them I'd had some help finding them. They asked what kind. I looked at the tree line one last time. Rex was there, just for a second, dark and completely still against the green like he'd always been, watching, the way he always watched, and then he was gone, just like that, like he'd never been there at all. Hard to explain, I said. Nobody pushed it. They wrapped a blanket around me and someone gave me water. But I knew exactly what had found me on day 2 when everything else in the jungle would have wanted me gone. I knew what had stayed every single morning when it had absolutely no reason to. No reason I could name. I knew what had just led me out of 7 days of jungle with nothing but direction and strange loyalty. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't ask for logic, that Rex wasn't finished with me. This wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. I just had absolutely no idea yet what it was beginning of. Drop a comment. Do you think Rex chose Kai on purpose? Or is something much bigger pulling the strings here? They kept me in the hospital for 4 days. Observation, they called it. I called it lying in a bed staring at a ceiling thinking about Rex. The doctors said I was lucky. Mild dehydration, a few infected cuts, nothing that wouldn't heal in a week or 2 with rest. Lucky. That word kept showing up everywhere around me. Everyone used it. The nurses, the search team, my mom when she finally got there. She held me for a long time without saying anything. Then she pulled back and looked at my face like she was checking something. You look different, she said. I didn't know what to tell her. I felt different, like something had been rearranged while I wasn't paying attention. I didn't tell anyone about Rex. Not in the hospital. Not in the official debrief with the search coordinator who asked me to walk through the 7 days. I said I found water, built shelter, stayed near the crash site as long as I could before following a stream. Standard survival story. Clean and simple. Nobody asked why I looked so calm for someone who'd been alone in a jungle for a week. I think they assumed shock. Maybe it was. Maybe not. My mom took me home on day 5. Back to our apartment in the city. 11th floor. Windows overlooking a parking garage. No jungle. No Rex. I slept for about 14 hours the first night. When I woke up, I lay there in the dark for a long time just listening to the city sounds outside. Car horns, a siren somewhere, someone's music bleeding through the wall. All of it felt weirdly loud and weirdly wrong at the same time. I kept reaching for sounds that weren't there anymore. The clicking, the rhythmic scrape of something moving through undergrowth. The jungle's constant pulse. It was completely gone now and replaced by nothing but ordinary city noise. And the absence of it bothered me significantly more than I wanted to admit to myself. I told myself Rex was fine. Rex was always fine. He was an apex predator built by millions of years of evolution. He didn't need me to worry about him. I told myself the particular lie a lot over the next several weeks. It helped a little. Honestly, not very much at all. School started again 3 weeks after I got back. Everyone had heard the story, or a version of it, before I even walked through the door. The kid who survived the plane crash. The jungle survivor. Teachers gave me extra time on assignments. Other students either avoided me or asked too many questions. I genuinely and completely preferred the ones who avoided me entirely. At least they were being fully honest about not knowing what to say to someone like me. My friend Danny was the only one who actually asked something real. We were sitting at lunch and he said, "What was the scariest part?" I thought about it for a second. "Day 2. I said. Something found me and I didn't know if I was going to make it out of that moment. He waited. I didn't explain further. He nodded like that was enough. Danny was good at not pushing. That's why he was still my friend. Here's the thing about nearly dying that nobody really tells you. It doesn't make you feel grateful the way people seem to expect it to. It makes you feel awake, uncomfortably, relentlessly awake, like a dial got turned up somewhere and nobody told you how to turn it back down. Colors looked slightly more saturated. Sounds were sharper. I noticed things I'd walked past 100 times before. Textures, angles, the way light moved. My biology teacher mentioned centipedes during a unit on arthropods about a month after I got back. I sat up so fast I knocked my pen off the desk. She pulled up a photo of a Scolopendra gigantea on the projector. "Largest centipede species in the world," she said. "Native to South American rainforests." I stared at that photo for the entire class. The coloring was close. The body shape was close. But the size she listed, 30 centimeters max, was wrong. Rex had been considerably longer than that. Significantly longer. I knew the exact length of my own arm. I knew exactly what I had seen. After class 1 stayed behind and asked if there were larger species. She looked at me a little sideways and said there weren't any documented ones. Documented? That specific word sat with me for quite a while afterward and I kept turning it over and over in my mind without getting anywhere useful. That night, I fell down a research spiral that lasted until 2 in the morning. Centipede biology, arthropod genetics, anomalous sightings in rainforest regions. Most of what I found was either completely standard or completely ridiculous. Forums full of people claiming they'd seen impossible things. I closed 14 tabs, but one thing kept surfacing. Indigenous accounts from several communities near where our plane went down described a creature roughly translated as the guardian of deep places. It was described as large, armored, ancient, something that didn't belong to the ordinary food chain, something that chose, when it chose at all, who it protected. I read that specific word 3 full times. Chose. Not something that stumbled into contact by accident. Something that made a deliberate selection. I didn't sleep much at all that night. I lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the word chose until morning arrived. 2 months passed. I went to school. I did homework. I ate dinner with my mom and answered her questions about my day and tried to seem like I was returning to normal. I wasn't returning to normal at all. And I think somewhere underneath everything I already knew that. I was waiting for something. I just didn't know what. Then in late November, on a Tuesday. I have a thing about Tuesdays now. I was walking home from school when I felt it. A vibration through the soles of my shoes. Faint, rhythmic. Coming from somewhere below and ahead of me on the sidewalk. I stopped walking. My heart was doing something irregular. I looked around at the perfectly ordinary city street. Buses, coffee shops, people walking dogs. Nothing out there. Obviously nothing. A perfectly ordinary city street doing perfectly ordinary city things. I was clearly losing it completely. I started walking again and forced myself to keep moving. And then I looked down at the grate of a storm drain I was about to step directly over. 2 antennae visible through the gap. Dark and long, moving in those slow deliberate arcs I knew by heart. Testing the air above the street. I stopped breathing entirely and just stayed there crouched on the sidewalk with the city moving around me like nothing was happening. Very slowly, I crouched down until my face was level with the grate. The gap between the metal bars was maybe 4 centimeters wide. On the other side of those metal bars, down in the shadows below the street surface, something enormous was looking back up at me through the dark. The eyes looking up at me from the dark. Cluster the way I had memorized. Completely and absolutely unmistakable. Rex, I said out loud like a person who had completely lost perspective on what was normal. A woman walking past gave me a very specific look. I didn't care. The antennae moved, both of them at once, toward me. The way they did when he was acknowledging something. The way I'd learned to read it. How are you even here right now? I whispered at a storm drain on a city sidewalk like a completely reasonable person. We're 1,100 kilometers from where I found you. He didn't answer, obviously. But he was there. He was real. He was looking at me through a storm drain in the middle of a city like this was a completely reasonable situation. I sat down on the sidewalk right there in the middle of everything. Another person walked around me with a look. I genuinely did not care about that at all. Okay, I said slowly, processing this in real time. Okay, so you followed me across 1,100 kilometers, through a city, into a storm drain. Okay, the antennae moved again in that familiar slower. I had absolutely no scientific basis for interpreting that as agreement. I chose to do it anyway. Here is what I actually knew about Rex at that point. First, he was far too big to be any documented Scolopendra species by a very significant margin. Second, he had demonstrated what I could only honestly describe as deliberate and targeted protective behavior on at least clearly separate occasions. He had somehow tracked me from a rainforest in South America to a storm drain under a city street 1,100 kilometers away. And I had absolutely no working framework for any single part of this situation and hadn't had one since day 2 in the jungle. I also knew one more thing, something I had been actively and deliberately trying not to think about since day 2 back in the jungle when it started. When Rex had first found me, when he'd come out of the brush and stopped and looked at me and then just settled down nearby, it hadn't felt random. It hadn't felt like an animal stumbling into an injured human. It had felt like something arriving at a destination, like something that had been looking. I pushed the thought down for 2 months. Right now, crouched on a sidewalk staring into a storm drain, it came back up with significant force. What do you actually want from me? I asked the storm drain great on a Tuesday afternoon in November on a city sidewalk. Completely normal behavior. The question hung out there in the cold November air between me and the drain. A bus went past and shook the grate slightly under its weight. Rex didn't move. His antennae swept. Then he went still. Then, and I am being completely precise here, he moved to the left inside the drain, stopped at the left edge of the drain opening, came back to center position, paused, did the whole thing again deliberately. Left, back to center, left again, back to center, clear and repeated like something being communicated very carefully to someone slow to understand. I stood up slowly. I looked left down the sidewalk. It was the direction away from my apartment, away from home, toward the older part of the city. You want me to go left down the street? I said to a giant centipede sitting in a city storm drain. This was apparently my life now, and I had accepted it. Rex went completely still in the drain below me, both antennae flat, body motionless, which I had learned to read as something close to correct. I stood there for a long moment with the wind picking up around me and the city doing its constant indifferent thing in every direction. Every reasonable part of my brain said go home, call someone, tell your mom, talk to the school counselor you'd been avoiding for 2 months. I stood there with the wind picking up and looked down at the grate one final time before I made any kind of decision about this. Rex was still there, still waiting, the same way he'd waited outside my shelter every morning in the jungle. Patient in a way that didn't feel like an animal's patience. It felt like a certainty, like something that had already calculated the outcome and was just waiting for me to catch up to it. I stood there for one more long moment. Then I reached down and picked my backpack up from the sidewalk where I dropped it without noticing. Okay, Rex, I said, but I want it on record that if this goes badly in any way, I am blaming you completely and without hesitation. His antennae moved once in that familiar slower. I chose to interpret that as understood and acknowledged. It was all I had to work with. I adjusted my backpack on my shoulders, took one breath, and started walking left down the sidewalk into the older part of the city. He moved with me through the drain system below my feet. I could feel the faint vibration of him keeping pace just under the surface of the street. I walked for about 6 blocks before the vibration stopped. I stopped too, looked around. An alley. Narrow. A dumpster. a fire escape, a door at the far end that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, and on the ground near the base of the far wall, just visible in the late afternoon shadow, something that shouldn't have been there. A scolopendra, small, normal-sized, maybe 20 centimeters at most, curled on its side near the base of the wall, completely still, not moving at all, but around it, scratched into the concrete in rough, uneven lines, a pattern, concentric arcs, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. I walked toward it slowly, crouched down. The small centipede was dead, had been for a while, but the marks around it hadn't been made by an animal. The lines were too deliberate, too consistent. Whatever had made them had pressed with the same pressure at the same angle throughout. No animal does that. My hand was already hovering over the concrete pattern before I consciously decided to reach out. I traced one of the outer arcs very slowly with my fingertip. The moment I touched it, I want to be very careful about how I say this because I know exactly how it sounds. The air changed. Not temperature, not wind. Something underneath those things. A pressure shift, like when you're on a plane and it changes altitude and your ears need a second to adjust. Except it wasn't my ears adjusting to anything. It was something else. Something I didn't have a word for and still don't entirely. It was everywhere, inside and outside at the same time. Like something had noticed me touching that mark and had responded to it. I pulled my hand back fast and sat very still with my heart doing something complicated in my chest. Nothing else happened. The alley was quiet. After about a minute, I looked down at the storm drain cover a few feet away. Rex's antennae were visible through the gap, watching me the way he always watched. Patient and fixed and completely unreadable in a way I had stopped trying to decode months ago. What is this place? I asked the drain cover and the dead centipede and the scratched pattern and the cold alley air. My voice came out much quieter than I intended. He didn't answer. He never answered. The antennae just moved in that slow arc I had learned to read, without justification, as, you already know you'll figure this out. I looked at the pattern on the concrete again. I looked at the dead centipede at its center. I looked at the door at the far end of the alley that hadn't been open in a long time. I thought about those indigenous accounts of something ancient that had never belonged to the ordinary food chain of any world I understood. I thought specifically and carefully about the word chose and what it meant if something like Rex had been looking for something like me on purpose. I stood up slowly from the crouch I'd been in. I walked the length of the alley to the door at the far end. I reached out and tried the handle. It opened without resistance, smoothly, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment and had no intention of making me work for it. Of course it opened. Of course it did. Because apparently this was just how my life worked now, and I had already decided somewhere back on that sidewalk to stop being surprised by it. Something is waiting behind the door, and Rex led Kai straight to it. What do you think is on the other side? Drop your theory below. The door opened into a stairwell, old concrete, a single bulb hanging from a wire above the first landing, flickering every few seconds like it couldn't commit. The smell hit me first. Not bad exactly, just old. Dust and something underneath it, faintly mineral, like wet stone after rain deep underground. I stood in the doorway for a moment with one hand still on the frame. Behind me, the alley. Ahead of me, the stairs going down. Of course they went down. Obviously they went down. Because apparently when a giant centipede leads you somewhere, it leads you underground. That tracks completely. I checked my phone. 3 bars of signal. Battery at 62%. I turned on the flashlight and started down the stairs. The stairwell went to full floors below street level before it opened into a corridor. Narrow. Brick walls on both sides, old enough that the mortar had started pulling back from the edges. The corridor ran straight ahead maybe 30 meters and then turned. I could see the turn clearly in the flashlight beam. I could not see past it. I walked. Each footstep sounded slightly too loud in the enclosed space. I counted them out of habit. 22 steps to the turn. Around the corner, a room. Large, low ceiling. The kind of space that used to be something functional and had been empty long enough to forget what. Broken shelving along one wall. The rusted frame of something that might have been machinery once. A drain in the center of the floor. And on every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling in the corner above the drain. The same pattern I had seen scratched into the alley concrete outside. Concentric arcs, dozens of them, overlapping and intersecting in ways that made the room feel like it was moving slightly if I looked at it too long. I stood at the entrance to the room and did not go in immediately. I am not completely reckless. I just paused to assess the situation for a second. The drain in the center of the floor was the largest one I'd ever seen up close, maybe a meter across. The grate was old iron, surface eaten through in places, and through the gaps in the grate, looking up at me from whatever was below, were the eyes I had come to know better than I'd expected to know the eyes of a giant centipede. Rex, right on schedule, present and watching and apparently very comfortable with the fact that he had just led me into a basement covered in ancient symbols. Okay, I said to the room. So this is a thing that exists? My voice bounced off the low ceiling in a way I didn't love. I kept my feet at the entrance. I took out my phone and photographed the walls. All of them. Then the ceiling. Then the drain. Methodical. My hands were steady, which surprised me a little. Then I crouched at the entrance and examined the floor near my feet. The pattern there was different, more layered, like outer arcs had been added over time by different hands. Different hands. I sat with that for a moment. This hadn't been made by one person in one session. This had accumulated. Over how long I couldn't tell from looking at it. I looked at the drain. Rex's antennae were moving, both of them oriented toward the center of the room, toward the drain itself, and not toward me. He wasn't watching me right now. For the first time since I'd known him, he was watching the room itself. That distinction landed differently than I expected it to. I stood up and walked into the room. My feet crossed the threshold and immediately I felt it again. The pressure shift, the same one from the alley when I touched the scratched arc with my finger, except stronger this time. Not uncomfortable, just present, like walking into a room where someone is already having a conversation you can't hear, but can feel the edges of. I crossed to the drain and crouched beside it. Rex's antennae tracked toward me again now that I was close. His body was coiled in the dark below, relaxed. The grate had markings on it too, carved into the iron itself, not scratched after the fact. These had been put there when the grate was made. Someone had planned this. I put my hand on the iron dot cold. Slightly damp, the pressure in the room shifted again when I touched it, less subtle this time, more like a response. Okay, I said quietly. I keep touching things and something keeps responding. That's either very good or extremely bad and I genuinely cannot tell which yet. Rex's antennae swept forward. I was reading that as, probably fine. Keep going. I was aware this was not a reliable interpretation system. I kept using it anyway. I looked at the carvings on the grate more carefully. They weren't random markings. They were consistent, repeated units arranged in a structure. Almost like a text. Almost like a language. Not one I recognized, but structured enough that I could see the repetition in it, the way certain units came back in different combinations. I photographed the grate from different angles. Then I sat back on my heels and looked at the entire room again with fresh eyes and tried to think clearly. This was not random. None of this was random. The pattern in the alley had been close enough to the entrance of this building to be a marker. A sign pointing at something. The patterns on the walls were layers of the same base structure, built up over time. The great carvings were something more concentrated, more intentional. And Rex had led me here, had tracked me from a rainforest to a city, had navigated a storm drain system I didn't understand, and had stopped directly above the specific basement. I had stopped looking for coincidences in any of this approximately 30 seconds. After I walked through the door, there weren't any coincidences here to find. The question I kept coming back to was simpler than all of it. What was this place for? Not what it used to be as a building. What was this room for? What were the patterns doing? I sat down fully on the cold floor beside the drain and just absorbed it. My brain was doing its cataloging thing, not thinking exactly, just filing without sorting. Waiting. Rex had gone still below me, both antennae flat. The room was completely quiet except for a faint sound I slowly identified as water moving somewhere much further below. Running water, deep underground, not sewage. The smell was wrong for that. Something older than the infrastructure around it. 17 minutes passed. I know because I checked my phone twice. 17 minutes of sitting on a cold basement floor surrounded by overlapping arcs while Rex waited below. This was my life now. I had made a deliberate and conscious peace with it somewhere between the jungle and that sidewalk, and I wasn't going back on the decision. Then something changed. Not a sound exactly. A shift in the quality of the air in the room. The same pressure thing, but different this time. Directional. Coming from the wall to my left. The one with the densest concentration of overlapping arcs, where the patterns were oldest and most worn. I turned my head. The wall looked exactly the same as it had for the last 17 minutes. Brick. Old mortar. Patterns scratched into the surface by too many different hands over too much time. Except one section of it, maybe half a meter wide, at roughly eye level if I were standing, was slightly warmer than the rest of the wall. I could feel it from where I was sitting. I stood up from the crouch I'd been holding, crossed to the warmer section of wall very slowly, put my palm flat and fully against the brick and waited. Warm. Noticeably. specifically warm in a way that bricks in an underground basement have no business being. Like there was something generating heat on the other side, and under my hand, faint but unmistakable, a vibration. Not mechanical, not pipes or infrastructure, something organic, the same rhythm as the sound Rex made when he was close and settled and not threatened. A pulse. The wall had a pulse, slow and steady and completely impossible and 100% real under my hand in the basement room. I pulled my hand back from the wall, looked at my palm, looked back at the brick. My heart was doing its complicated thing again, and this time I didn't blame it. "Rex," I said. My voice came out completely steady, which felt dishonest given what my heart was doing. "There's something in the wall." From below the drain came a sound I had never heard Rex make before. Not the low mechanical threat is, not silence, something between. A low resonance I felt in my chest more than heard. I put my hand back on the warm section of the wall and held it there this time. Steady, deliberate, waiting to see what would happen if I didn't pull away. The vibration under my palm increased the moment contact was reestablished. Responsive, aware. Like something on the other side had noticed the hand was back and adjusted accordingly. Then the bricks moved. Not crumbled, not fell. Moved deliberately, sliding inward as a controlled section. Like a mechanism that had been waiting a long time for this exact contact. Not collapsed, slid inward as a section roughly the size of a doorway. Smooth and completely controlled. Like something on the other side had been waiting for the right pressure at the right point. Behind the bricks, darkness, and from the darkness, a smell. The same mineral wet stone smell as the stairwell, but stronger now. Much stronger, and under it something else. Something alive. I stood in front of the new opening with my flashlight raised and didn't move for a full 15 seconds. My feet absolutely refused to make any decision without the rest of me. Then Rex came up through the drain, all the way up, pulling himself through those iron gaps with that fluid, impossible coordination I have been watching for weeks now. All of him, pulling himself through the iron gaps with that fluid, impossible coordination I had watched for 7 days in a jungle and still found extraordinary. He crossed the cold stone floor toward me without hesitation and stopped precisely at the threshold of the new opening in the wall, right at the boundary between known and unknown. He turned his broad flat head and looked back at me clearly, both antennae oriented forward and direct, the way they got when he was communicating something he considered obvious. Then he turned back toward the darkness on the other side and moved through the opening in the wall like it was the most natural next step in any reasonable sequence of events. I stood there at the threshold for a moment. Behind me was the basement and the drain and the stairwell and the city. Ahead was Rex and the dark and whatever came after choosing. I thought about my mom at home probably making dinner right now. I thought about Danny who had asked the right question and then respected the answer I hadn't given. I thought about Chose. I thought about the dead centipede in the alley with the pattern scratched around it, a marker, a signal, something left by something to indicate a location. Not for anyone, for someone specific. I thought about the pressure that had shifted when I touched those arcs. The response that was too immediate and too directed to be environmental coincidence. Something in this city, something old and underground and moving through infrastructure nobody tracked, had been paying attention. Not to the crash, not to the jungle specifically. To me, before the crash, before the jungle, before any of it had happened at all. That was the part that didn't fit any framework. That thought should have sent me back up those stairs immediately. I cataloged it carefully. I noted that it should have done that. Then I adjusted my grip on the flashlight, took one breath that was slightly more deliberate than usual, and walked through the opening in the wall after Rex into whatever was next. The space beyond was vast. My flashlight beam reached for the ceiling and the far wall and found neither. The air moved in slow circulation. The space went far in multiple directions. The floor was stone, not poured concrete, actual cut stone, fitted together without mortar, worn smooth by something that had passed over it many times across what felt like a very long time. And on the walls, not scratched, not carved by hand, the pattern, the concentric arcs, were rendered here in something bioluminescent, faintly glowing in a blue-green that my flashlight almost washed out. Almost, but not quite enough to wash out. The glow pushed back against the beam and held its own in the corners and along the lower sections of wall where the patterns were densest. I turned the flashlight off completely and stood in the dark for a moment while my eyes adjusted to what was actually in the room without the beam cutting across it. The patterns glowed, softly, steadily, like something that didn't need to be dramatic because it had been doing this long enough to know it would be found when it was supposed to be found. Rex was visible ahead of me in the bioluminescent light, his exoskeleton catching the glow and throwing back a faint red-brown reflection. That moved with his legs. He stopped ahead of me at a point I couldn't identify any reason for. Waited in that patient way. Looked back at me one final time with both antennae raised and forward. The patterns on the walls pulsed once, slow and synchronized. The way a heartbeat sounds when you put your ear against something alive. I turned my flashlight back on. Took one breath that I tried to make slower than my heart was currently suggesting. Looked at Rex. Looked at the dark ahead of both of us. Okay, I said out loud to Rex and the dark and whatever had been paying attention to me for longer than I knew about. My voice came back from the walls in a way that felt like it was being heard. I'm here, I said. Now what? The question went out into the bioluminescent dark and the patterns on the walls pulsed once more in response. Slow. Certain. Patient as something very old. The answer didn't come in words. It came from the walls themselves, from those concentric arcs pulsing blue-green across every surface of the chamber around me. Not words, not sound, the patterns. Those concentric arcs glowing blue-green across every surface, pulsed again. Once, twice, then a third time, and this time the rhythm was different. Not random, not decorative, a sequence. The same 3-beat pattern repeated with a pause between each repetition, like something establishing a signal before transmitting the actual message. I stood in the middle of the vast underground space with my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the bioluminescent dark and understood something with sudden clarity. This had been running long before I arrived. The patterns weren't waiting to start. They had been pulsing continuously through this underground space. For longer than the building above it had existed. Whatever this place was, it wasn't built for me specifically. It had been built for whoever Rex decided to bring here. And Rex had been making the decision for longer than I had been alive. That thought sat in my chest like a stone, solid and heavy, and strangely not frightening. More like clarifying, like a piece of information that reorganized everything around it. Rex was about 12 meters ahead of me in the bioluminescent glow, his exoskeleton throwing back faint red-brown light with each step of his yellow legs across the cut stone floor. He had stopped at the center of the space, directly below where the ceiling arched highest, a dome I hadn't seen until I was deep enough inside to look back up at it from the right angle. I walked toward him. My footsteps on the cut stone made a sound that went up into the dome and came back down softer, like the room was absorbing the impact and returning something quieter. When I reached Rex, I crouched beside him the way I had learned to do in the jungle on the days when he settled near me and we just stayed in proximity without agenda. He didn't move away. He hadn't moved away from me once in all the weeks I had known him. I was aware that this fact meant something I still didn't have complete language for. The walls pulsed again. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Pause. The sequence rolled from the far end of the space toward us like a slow wave crossing a very still body of water. When it reached the section of wall closest to where Rex and I were crouched, something happened that I hadn't seen in the other pulses. The arcs closest to us didn't just glow. They moved, shifted, the lines reorganizing slightly in the moment of highest brightness, like a screen refreshing its display. I leaned forward, looked at the wall section. The arcs had rearranged into a configuration that was different from the base pattern I'd been seeing for the past hour. Different in a specific way. Not random variation. A deliberate departure from the established structure. The same way a sentence departs from a grammar rule to make a particular emphasis. Something had changed the pattern in response to where we were standing. In response to Rex being in this specific location with me beside him. Rex had raised both antennae and oriented them toward the altered wall section. With the same focused attention he had given the boar's sound, the spider's approach, the route out through the jungle trees. He was reading it. I was almost completely sure of that. Rex was reading the wall the way he had always read the terrain around us, with full attention and no hesitation. I looked back at the altered arcs. I had my phone out already. I'd been photographing continuously since I entered, and I zoomed in as far as the camera would. Go and took a series of shots. Then I looked without the phone, without trying to decode or categorize. Just looked the way I learned to look at Rex in the early days, letting information arrive before forcing a label on it, and slowly, the way things resolve when you stop forcing them, I saw it. Not all of it, enough to know what it was doing. The altered section wasn't showing me a symbol, it was showing me a direction. The arcs weren't arcs in this configuration, they were vectors. Each line had a terminus. Each terminus pointed the same way, down and slightly north. I checked my phone's compass immediately, and confirmed the direction before I let myself trust the reading I was getting from the arcs. I looked at the floor beneath the altered section. The stone joins there were more precise, deliberately cut, a seam in a rough rectangle, the size of a large trapdoor. Oh, I said out loud to the empty chamber. The word came back from the dome above, softer, absorbed. There's another level below this one. Of course there was. Rex moved. He crossed from where we'd been crouching to the seam in the floor, his legs covering the distance in that fluid rolling motion I had stopped finding disturbing weeks ago. He settled at the edge of the rectangle and went completely still. Both antennae down, body flat, the position I had come to read as, "This is the moment. This is the thing. Pay attention now." I crossed to the seam and crouched at the edge. The stone was cut with a precision the rest of the floor didn't have. Tighter margins, cleaner edges. Someone had made and closed this opening with great care. The walls pulsed again. 3 beats. But this time on the third beat the bioluminescent glow intensified. Not the whole room. Just the dome section directly above the seam in the floor. Like a spotlight aimed with intention. Like something that had been waiting a long time for the right person to be crouching above this exact section of floor before it pointed. "Okay," I said to Rex and the room. "I see it. I just need 1 second to acknowledge that every rational part of my brain has been offline since approximately November Tuesday." Rex waited. Rex's antennae moved in a short, deliberate arc. I read that as, noted, acknowledged, we are moving on now and the commentary is not necessary or helpful to the process. I pressed my palm flat against the stone within the seam. The same thing as the wall, warmth. Specific and localized and impossible for a stone floor to produce on its own in an underground space. And a pulse beneath my palm. The exact same 3-beat rhythm as the walls above. As if whatever was generating all of it was located directly below the spot where I was kneeling. I pressed harder. The stone didn't move. I ran my hands around the edges of the seam, looking for the mechanism, the pressure point, the thing that opened it the way the wall had opened. Nothing gave on the edges at all. I shifted to the center of the rectangle and pressed there instead with both palms flat and my full weight behind them. The stone sank, half a centimeter, then got, then, with a sound like something very old releasing a breath it had been holding for a very long time, it slid aside. Cold air came up from below, damp and mineral and deeper smelling than anything I had encountered yet. And with it, light, not my flashlight, not bioluminescence, something else. A steady, sourceless pale light from below, even and cool. The kind of light that doesn't flicker because it isn't generated by combustion or electricity. The kind of light I had no category for. Not electricity, not fire, not bioluminescence. Something older than any of those things and completely steady in a way none of them ever are. I looked down through the opening. Stone steps going down. The pale light coming from everywhere and nowhere along the walls of the stairwell below. And at the bottom of the steps, visible from where I crouched at the lip of the opening, a space I could barely process. Not a room, a chamber. Vast in a different way from the space I was already in. This one felt intentional in its scale, shaped with purpose rather than excavated for utility. The walls curved inward at the bottom in a shape that focused the eye toward the center. At the center, something I couldn't identify from this angle and distance. Large, organic, pulsing with that same slow 3-beat rhythm that the walls had been displaying since I walked into this space. Rex moved from where we'd been positioned and crossed to the edge of the opening. He looked down into the pale light below. Then he turned his head and looked back at me with both antennae forward. His antennae swept forward, both of them, full extension. The maximum degree of forward orientation I had ever seen from him. Every single time, his antennae had done something like that in the jungle. What followed had mattered significantly. I had a perfect record of that observation and I was going to use it. I sat at the edge of the opening with my legs hanging over and my flashlight in my hand, and my phone in my pocket with 71 photographs of things I didn't yet understand. I thought about day 2 in the jungle. The moment he had come out of the brush and looked at me and made whatever decision he had made. I thought about every morning after that. Every morning he was there when I woke up. Every direction he had pointed me in that had turned out to matter. I thought about the 7 days and the spider and the rescue and the storm drain and the alley and the concentric arcs and the pulse in the wall and the pale light coming up from below. I thought about the word chose. And then I thought about what it meant to choose back. What it meant to decide that whatever this was, I was going to be present for it. Not by accident, on purpose. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds. Rex waited, completely still, both antennae at full extension. The walls pulsed their 3-beat rhythm. The pale light from below stayed even and steady and patient. Then I put my flashlight in my jacket pocket, gripped the edge of the opening with both hands, and lowered myself onto the first step. The stone was solid under my feet. The pale light was steady. Rex followed immediately behind me. I could hear the soft rhythmic movement of his legs on the stone steps, keeping pace, staying close. We went down together, 14 steps, each one bringing the chamber below into greater clarity as my angle changed and the full scale of it opened up ahead of me. At the bottom step, I stopped walking and stood still and just looked at what was ahead of me and tried to let my brain file it before I started asking it to understand anything. The chamber was circular, maybe 40 meters across. Walls curved inward precisely, pulling the eye to the center. The pale light came from the walls, same arcs as above, but finer and more alive. At the center of the chamber was whatever had been generating all of it, the pulse, the light, the 3-beat rhythm that had been running through every wall of this underground network. No word for it. Closest, a living structure, 3 meters tall, grown from the same bioluminescent material as the wall arcs, but concentrated into something with real density and a slow visible pulse. It pulsed, 3 beats, slow and clear. The walls of the chamber answered without delay. 3 beats back, synchronized, like they had been doing this exchange for a very long time. A conversation. This was a conversation that had been happening in this chamber for longer than anyone who built anything above it had been alive. Rex walked past me and crossed the chamber floor toward the structure without hesitation. He had been here before. That was clear in the way he moved, not exploring, not cautious. Returning, he settled at the base of the structure and went completely still. The way he went still when he was most at rest, most himself. His antennae lay flat, his body curved slightly inward. The structure pulsed. Rex's exoskeleton caught the light and pulsed back. I could see it, faint but real. A bioluminescent response traveling along the segments of his body from head to tail. They were talking. Rex and this thing were in communication, and they had been in communication for a very long time. And I was standing at the edge of a conversation I didn't have the language for yet. I walked toward the center of the chamber slowly. The structure's pulse didn't change. The walls didn't change. Rex didn't move. At 3 meters from the structure, the chamber pressure shifted. The same force I had felt since the alley arcs. But here at the source, it was orders of magnitude stronger and unmistakably directed at me. And it was directed. Not ambient, not diffuse. It was oriented toward me with the same kind of specific attention that Rex had oriented toward me on day 2 in the jungle. Something in this chamber was looking at me directly. Something that had been waiting for me to arrive at the bottom of these particular steps for longer than I could estimate. I stopped at 3 meters from the structure and held my position and tried to breathe at a normal rate and look like someone who did this kind of thing regularly. I did not succeed at the last part. Okay, I said, steady voice. I was genuinely proud of that. I know Rex. He's been with me a while. I trust him more than most things. If he led me here, then this is where I'm supposed to be standing. The structure pulsed once in response, harder than the baseline rhythm. A single sharp beat that rolled outward to the walls and came back amplified. The walls answered immediately and clearly. I don't know what you are. I continued. I don't know this place. I don't know what Rex told you about me or how long you've been running the 3-beat pattern. But I'm listening. A pause. The pale light held completely steady across every surface of the chamber. The structure waited. The walls waited. Rex waited. Everything down here was very good at waiting. But I'm 14 years old and I survived a plane crash and 7 days in a jungle. And whatever this is, I'm paying attention. So if you've got something to show me, show me. The structure pulsed. 3 beats. Then a 4th. A beat I hadn't heard before in the sequence. An addition. A response. The walls took it up. That 4-beat pattern spreading outward from the center of the chamber, and a wave. That rolled up the curved walls and across the ceiling and back down again. The pale light intensified across the entire space, still even, still cool, but brighter. Like something turning up a dial it had kept low for a very long time while waiting for the right person to be here. Rex raised both antennae to full extension simultaneously and oriented them directly toward me. The most deliberate signal I had ever seen from him in all the weeks I had known him. Then the structure did something it hadn't done before. The arcs at its surface shifted, the same way the wall arcs had shifted earlier, reorganizing from base pattern into vectors into meaning. Except this wasn't direction. The lines reorganized into something I looked at for a long moment before something shifted in my understanding. Not comprehension, not language. Recognition. The same way you recognize something you've never encountered before, but somehow already know the exact shape of. like a word in a language you didn't know you had learned. I looked at Rex. He was completely still with his antennae at full extension and his exoskeleton pulsing faintly in time with the structure beside him. He had been here before. He had been part of this for a very long time, and he had crossed a rainforest and a city and a storm drain system to get to me specifically and bring me to this specific spot. Not because I was special. I was fairly certain I wasn't special in any traditional sense. No unusual abilities, no hidden knowledge, nothing that would show up on any kind of test. Because I was next. Because this needed someone who would walk into a jungle, survive on almost nothing, look a giant centipede in the eyes, and choose to follow instead of run. That was the criteria. Not courage exactly. Something more specific than courage. A willingness to stay present when every instinct said leave. A willingness to let something unfamiliar be real. I had done exactly that on day 2 without knowing it was a test. I'd stood there scared to run and accidentally pass whatever this had been looking for. The bar was very specific. I looked back at the structure. The shifted arcs held their new configuration without moving, steady and patient and waiting in the way that everything down here was extremely good at waiting. Okay, I said, for what felt like the 100th time. But this one was different. Not the okay of someone processing. This was the okay of someone who had already decided and was just saying it out loud. I stepped forward across the last 3 meters of chamber floor. I raised my hand. I put my palm flat against the surface of the structure and held it there and waited to see what happened next. The pulse traveled up my arm instantly. Not painful, not uncomfortable, just present. The 3-beat rhythm from the walls, now inside me, running through my body until it matched my heartbeat exactly. The pale light exploded across the entire chamber at once. Every arc on every surface lit simultaneously at full intensity, like something that had been holding itself in reserve finally letting go completely. Rex let out the low chest resonance, the one from when the wall opened. This time it held, blending with the pulse and the light into something that was simultaneously all 3 things at once. I stood with my hand on a living structure in a chamber underground while the walls blazed with bioluminescent light and Rex resonated beside me and something very old moved through my body in 3-beat time. And then it showed me things. Not images, not words. Something beneath language, the way you know you're falling before you've had time to name the sensation. Not images, not words. Something underneath language, the way you know you're falling before you have time to name the sensation. The way you know a song before you consciously recognize it. I saw the network, underground, global, older than any city above it, moving through the deep places of every continent, maintained by creatures like Rex, connected to structures like this one. I saw the gaps in the network. Places where the pulse had gone dark, where the connection had been broken, where something above ground had cut through or built over or destroyed what ran beneath. I saw what it had always done. Monitoring, measuring, tracking the slow, deep processes that human instruments were far too recent and too small scale to detect. The things that took whole centuries to shift. And I saw what happened when too many connections went dark simultaneously. What began to fail when the network couldn't complete the monitoring it had maintained without interruption for so long. I saw what was coming if too many connections went dark, clearly and in full detail. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that no ordinary framework prepares you to hold in your head all at once. I pulled my hand back from the surface of the structure and sat down hard on the stone floor of the chamber because my legs had made a unilateral decision that sitting was the correct response. The light in the chamber settled. The pulse in the walls returned to its 3-beat baseline. Rex's resonance faded gradually, like a note held until it found its natural end. I sat down on the stone floor of the chamber because my legs had decided. That was the appropriate response to what had just occurred. Rex crossed from the structure to where I was sitting and settled beside me. His body curved slightly inward the way it did when he was most at rest. His exoskeleton pulsed once, faint, and went still. I sat in the pale light of the underground chamber with Rex beside me and tried to find the edges of what I had just understood. The network was broken in places and worsening. Rex had been searching for someone to move through the world above and find the breaks. Repair them. Keep the pulse alive where it was going dark. Not because I was qualified. Because I was 14, had survived a crash, stood still instead of running, and followed a giant centipede through a city because he'd earned my trust over 7 days in a jungle. Because I was willing. That was apparently the whole criteria. Willingness plus the ability to move through the world above without attracting the kind of attention that would make this work impossible. I looked at Rex settle beside me on the stone floor. He was watching me with those small dark clustered eyes that had been watching me consistently and without judgment since day 2 in the jungle. You could have explained some of this earlier, I said. Day 3 would have worked. Before I named you after a dinosaur and started talking to you about protein bars. His antennae moved. I read that as the explanation required the location. The location required the journey. The journey required the trust. You can't shortcut the sequence. I thought about that particular point for a while. The sequence had been necessary. The trust had been necessary. You couldn't shortcut the 7 days any more than you could skip the steps going down. I thought about my mom making dinner somewhere above me. About Danny and his good question. About the math test that had felt so important on the Tuesday morning before everything reorganized itself entirely. I thought about the network going dark in the places where the breaks were spreading. The slow catastrophe that nobody above could see because they weren't looking in the right layer of the world. Rex waited. The walls pulsed. The structure held its new 4-beat rhythm, the one it hadn't had before I arrived. The beat it had added in direct response to me being the one who put their hand on it. I sat for a long time in the pale light of something very old that had been waiting a very long time for someone willing enough to find it. Then I stood up from the stone floor of the chamber, where something very old had just shown me the shape of something very large, and told me, without words, that I was the one who was going to help. Okay, I said, one last time, and this time, it meant none of the things it had meant before. It meant I'm in. It meant I understand. It meant, where do we start? And I meant every word. Rex rose, both antennae forward, body oriented toward the stairwell and the stone steps and the city above, and whatever broken place in the network was closest and needed attending to first. He started moving, purposeful and steady and completely certain in the way I had come to understand as his version of trust running in both directions. I followed Rex up the steps and through the chamber and back toward the stairwell and the city above, the way I had followed him through the jungle and across the city and down into the dark. I had a network to help repair, a giant centipede for a partner, and apparently a talent for staying present in situations that should have made me run. It wasn't the life I had planned for. But then, the plane went down on a Tuesday and I had a math test on Wednesday and plans had stopped being something I relied on heavily since then. I took the stone steps back up 2 at a time, my flashlight cutting ahead of me, the bioluminescent glow of the chamber fading behind me as the pale light gave way to the ordinary dark of the corridor. Rex kept pace behind me, yellow legs in that synchronized rhythm I had learned to find reassuring, exoskeleton catching the last pale light and sending it back in brief warm flashes as we climbed. The city was above us, the built world, the human world, the world that had no idea what was running beneath it. The network was below. Somewhere between those two things was the work. I had genuinely no idea what I was doing. I had a 14-year-old's understanding of almost everything that was going to be relevant to what came next. That was the starting point. But I had 7 days of jungle and 1 giant centipede, who had never once steered me in the wrong direction when it actually mattered. That record was worth something. That, it turned out, was enough to start with. Everything else could be figured out as it came. Rex would know the direction. I would find a way to move through whatever was in it. That's the end of part 4. And just the beginning of everything else. If you want to see where Kai and Rex go next, drop a comment and let me know. See you in part 5.